All right, so we're going to read our chapter 3 and Paddington marches on. This one is called Paddington Makes a Clean Sweep. All right, so what do you think, before I start, what do you think the story is going to be about? Okay, so did you think it was going to be about a broom? And why do you think it might have been about a broom? Maybe because of the word sweep. Well, there is a broom involved in the story, but not the kind you're thinking of. Let me show you the picture. So that type of broom is what chimney sweepers use to clean out your chimney. So sounds like to me, from the other stories we've been reading, Paddington is going to be cleaning out chimneys. Now, do you think this is going to be a good idea? My thought is a bear in the chimney cleaning a lot of black mess that someone's going to have to clean up. All right. Paddington stood in the middle of the Browns' dining room, gazed around with interest. When Mrs. Bird had brought him his breakfast in bed that morning, he had this suspicious feeling that something unusual was going on. Breakfast in bed on a weekday was a sure sign Mrs. Bird wanted him out of the way. But not even the distinct bumpy noises, which had been going on from quite an early hour, had in any way prepared him for the sight that met his eyes. Normally, the Browns' house was tidier than most, but on this particular morning, the dining room looked very much as if a hurricane had recently passed through. The furniture had all been moved to one end. The carpet had been rolled up and was standing against the walls. There was no curtains at the windows, and the pictures had all been taken down. Even the grate was cold and empty, and the only heat coming from the electric fire at one end of the room. "I didn't know you were cleaning your springs, Mrs. Bird," he exclaimed, looking surprised. "Not cleaning our springs," replied Mrs. Bird. "Spring cleaning. That's quite a different matter. It means cleaning the whole house out from top to bottom," explained Mrs. Brown. "It'll be your room next. We can't leave it a moment longer. So when my mom told us it was spring cleaning, we would run around in craziness, because that meant she took everything out of her kitchen cupboards and we had to climb up and wipe down the cupboards, or if they're at the bottom, we had to climb in the bottom cupboards and wipe them down, and then she wanted us to put everything back in nice and neat. And if there weren't matches to her Tupperware or plastic containers, then she threw them out. So spring cleaning, we scrubbed down her cupboards for her." "And talking of not leaving things a moment longer," said Mrs. Bird as she hurried out of the room, "if we don't get a move on and buy that curtain material, we shan't have any dinner tonight." "Do you think we ought to take him with us?" asked Mrs. Brown as she followed Mrs. Bird into the hall, leaving Paddington to investigate the unusual state of affairs in the dining room by himself. "He's got a very good eye for a bargain." "No," said Mrs. Bird firmly, "definitely not. It is bad enough shopping when the spring sales are on the best of times, but if that bear comes with us, there is no knowing what he shall end up with. Bargain or no bargain, he can stay and mind the house." Mrs. Brown cast a doubtful look after her housekeeper as she disappeared up the stairs. Although from past experiences she agreed with Mrs. Bird on the subject of Paddington accompanying them to the shopping expeditions, the thought of him being left in charge of the house when they were in the middle of spring cleaning raised even more serious doubts in her mind. "I can see it's going to be one of those days," she called at the sound of hammering coming from somewhere overhead. "What was the chimney and spring cleaning in the bargain? Anything can happen." "And probably will," said Mrs. Bird as she came back down the stairs adjusting her hat. "But worrying about it won't alter things. Where's that bear?" "I haven't given him his instructions yet." "Here I am, Mrs. Bird," called Paddington, hurrying into the hall. Mrs. Bird looked at him suspiciously. There was a gleam in his eyes, which she didn't like the look at all. But fortunately for Paddington, she was too much in a hurry to look deeply into the matter. "I've left you some cold sausages and a salad on the tray," she said, "and there's a treacle pudding ready on the stove. Only mind you, don't singe your whiskers when you light the gas, and don't let it boil dry. I don't want to find a nasty smell in the house when I get home." Thank you very much, Mrs. Bird, said Paddington. Perhaps I could do some tidying up while you're out, he added hopefully as he followed the others toward the front door. I have never done spring cleaning before. Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird exchanged glances. You may do some dusting, if you like, said Mrs. Brown, but I shouldn't do too much tidying up. It's all rather heavy, and you might strain yourself. I'm afraid we shall have to eat in the kitchen for a day or two. At least, Mr. Brown has cleaned the chimney, though goodness knows when that will be. Mrs. Brown gave Paddington one last look as she hurried after Mrs. Bird. I do hope he'll be all right, she said. Willing paws make light work, replied Mrs. Bird, and if it keeps him out of mischief, there won't be any great harm done. Mrs. Brown gave a sigh, but luckily for her peace of mind, every step down Windsor Gardens took her farther and farther away from number 32. For if she had been able to see inside her house at that moment, she might have felt even less happy about leaving Paddington to do his own devices. After he closed the front door, Paddington hurried back down the hall with an excited gleam in his eyes. There was an idea stirring in the back of his mind to do with a large, interesting-looking box with a Barkridge label tied to the outside, which he had seen standing by the dining-room fireplace. For some days the word chimney had cropped up a number of times in the Brown household. It had all started when Mrs. Bird opened the dining-room door one morning and found the room full of smoke. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Brown spent some time on the telephone only to announce that all the local chimney sweeps had so much work on their hands they were booked up for weeks to come. At that time, Paddington hadn't given the matter much thought. It seemed rather a lot of fuss to make over a little bit of smoke, and after peering up the chimney once or twice, he decided there wasn't much to see anyway, even when Mrs. Brown dropped a chance remark at breakfast one morning about doing it himself. He hadn't really paid a great deal of attention. But the news that operations were about to commence, together with the arrival of the mysterious-looking box, had aroused his interest at last. The outside of the box exceeded his wildest dreams. Even the label was exciting. It was made up of a number of brightly colored pictures called Easy Stages, and across the top in large capital letters were the words, Sweep It Clean, and the all-British do-it-yourself chimney sweep outfit. Underneath, in smaller print, the label went on to say that even a child of 10 could make the dirtiest chimney spotless in a matter of moments. To show how easy it all was, the first pictures had a small boy fitting the various bits and pieces together as he prepared to sweep his father's chimney. Paddington felt a slight pang of guilt as he lifted the lid of the box and peered inside, but he soon lost it again as he settled down in an armchair, dipping his paw into a jar of marmalade every now and then as he examined the contents. Although none of the pictures on the label mentioned anything about bears being able to sweep their chimney, it made everything look so clear and simple he began to wonder why anyone ever bothered to hire a real chimney sweep at all. One picture even showed a large bag labeled Soot standing next to the pile of silver coins and followed it with the inscription, Make money in your spare time by selling soot to your neighbors for their garden. Paddington couldn't quite picture Mr. Curry actually paying for someone else's soot, but all the same he began to feel that Mr. Brown's outfit was a good value indeed. Inside the box there was a large round brush together with a number of long rods with metal ends which screwed together to form one long pole. Underneath the rock was yet another compartment containing a sack for the soot and a sheet with 2 armholes so that the people sweeping the chimney could fit it to the mantelpiece and work without getting the rest of the room dirty. Paddington tried putting his paws through the sheet, and after screwing the brush on one of the rods, he spent several enjoyable minutes while he hurried around the room, poking it into various nooks and crannies. It was then that he decided to test it on the chimney himself, and a thoughtful expression gladly came over his face. The brush went up and down remarkably easy, and even with only one rod, the grate was full of soot in no time at all. Paddington grew more and more thoughtful as he shoveled the soot into the sack and then tried fixing a second rod to the first. Although Mrs. Brown hadn't actually mentioned anything about sweeping the chimney, he felt sure it was quite easily come under the heading of dusty. So he's poking that up, and you're supposed to be putting the soot in the bag, and that keeps it from getting clean. But if you notice, the soot is not going in the bag. It's mostly on the floor, and then It's flying through the air, and also it's leaving footprints around the room. Number 32 Windsor Gardens was a tall house, and as the bundle of rods by Paddington's side got smaller and smaller, so that the pile of soot in the grate grew larger and deeper, several times he had to stop and clear it away to make room for his paws. At first, the sack and then several of Mrs. Bird's old grocery boxes became full to the brim. He was beginning to give up hope of ever reaching the top when suddenly, without any warning, the brush freed itself and nearly fell over the grate as he clung to the last of the rods. Paddington sat in the fireplace for a while, mopping his brow with the corner of a sheet, and then, after disappearing upstairs for a few moments, he hurried outside, carried his binoculars. According to the note on the box lid, the exciting part about sweeping chimneys was always the moment when the brush popped out of the chimney pot, and he was particularly anxious to see this for himself. Carefully adjusting the glasses, he climbed the ladder which Mr. Briggs, the builder, had left standing against the side of the house, and peered up at the roof with a pleased expression on his face. The view through the binoculars of the brush poking out of Mr. Chimney's pot almost looked exactly like the picture on the box. Paddington spent some time drinking in the view, and then climbed back down to the ladder and hurried into the house, wearing the air of a bear with a job well done. All in all, it had been a good morning's work, and he felt sure the Browns would be very pleased when they reached home and found out how busy he had been. All right, so this is the pile, and look how black Paddington's fur is. And this is the pile of soot that has come out of the chimney. It isn't in the bag like it's supposed to be. Instead, there's piles of it right by the chimney fireplace. And then he's been going up and down the staircase with all that black soot on him. Pulling the brush back down the chimney proved to be a lot easier than pushing it up had been, and it seemed almost only a matter of moments before he found himself reaching up behind the sheet for the last of the rod. It was as if he disentangled himself from the sheet that a startled expression suddenly came over Paddington's face, and he nearly fell over backwards with surprise as he stared at the rod in his paw. He rubbed his eyes in case he had gotten some soot in them by mistake, and gazed at the end of the rod again. It was definitely the last one of the set, as he had counted them all most carefully, but the brush itself was not to be seen. So all the rods came down, but the brush part was still up out of the chimney. After peering hopefully up the chimney several times, Paddington sat down anxiously in the fireplace in order to consult the instructions on the box. So where did he sit? On those piles. As he lifted the lid, he suddenly caught sight of the large red label pasted to the bottom of the box. It had escaped his notice before, and now he read it. His eyes grew larger and larger. Warning. After sweeping the chimney, great care must be taken when unscrewing the rods. Otherwise, the brush may become detached. My brush become detached? Exclaimed Paddington bitterly, addressing the world in general as he gazed at the rod in one pan and the box paw and the box in the other. Apart from leaving the warning about the brush becoming detached until it was far too late, the only advice the notice seemed to give for when things did go wrong was contained in 4 words: consult your nearest dealer. That's the person who sells you. Paddington sat in the fireplace with a mournful expression on his face. He felt sure the Barkenridges would be all keen if he consulted them on the subject of Mr. Brown's brush being stuck up the chimney, and he was equally concerned that Mr. Brown himself would be even less happy when he heard the news. In fact, after giving the matter a great deal of thought, the only way he could see to soften the blow at all was to clear up some of the mess and hope that while he did so, he might get an idea on the subject. If earlier in the day the Browns' dining room had been given the impression of having been in the path of a hurricane, it now looked as if a belt of thick smog had passed through as well. Despite the dust sheet, everything seemed to be covered in a thin layer of soot, and looking round the room, Paddington decided that in more ways than one he had never seen things look quite so black. Mr. Brown took his head out of the chimney and looked round at the others. I can't understand it, he explained. That's the 3rd time I've tried to light the fire. It just keeps going out. Mrs. Brown picked up a newspaper and began waving some of the smoke away. There's obviously been another fall of soot, she said. If it's everywhere. If you ask me, the chimney's blocked. I told you it needed sweeping. How could I sweep it? Said Mr. Brown. The outfit only just arrived this morning. The Browns grouped themselves unhappily round the fireplace and stared at the pile of used matches. And that's another thing, continued Mr. Brown. I'm sending it straight back to the Barkenridges. It's filthy dirty, and there isn't even a brush. You can't sweep a chimney without a brush. Perhaps Paddington's brow borrowed it for something, said Mrs. Brown vaguely. I can't find him anywhere. Paddington? Echoed Mr. Brown. What would he want with a brush? There's no knowing, said Mrs. Bird ominously. Mr. Bird didn't like the sign of a hurried cleaning up, as she noticed in the dining room, or the various sooty paw marks which she discovered during a quick glance around the rest of the house. But in view of the look on Mr. Brown's face, she wisely kept her thoughts to herself. He hasn't touched his treacle pudding, said Mrs. Brown, and that's most unusual. Blow Paddington's treacle pudding, replied Mr. Brown. I'm worried about the fire. Mrs. Brown opened the French windows and looked into the garden. Perhaps Mr. Briggs can help. He's just come back. In answer to Mrs. Brown's call, Mr. Briggs, the builder, came into the dining room and put his ear to the chimney and experienced jackdaws. You've got a jackdaw's nest in your pot. If you listen, you can hear him coughing. Coughing? Exclaimed Mrs. Bird. I didn't know jackdaws coughed. You cough, ma'am? Said Mrs. Briggs. If someone tried to light the fire under your nest, don't you worry, he continued, opening Mrs. Brown's cleaning set. I'll have it out in a jiffy. The Browns stood back and watched while Mr. Briggs began pushing the rods up into the chimney. Good job you had these, he said. Otherwise, it might have been a rare old job. Mr. Briggs' face became redder and redder as the rods got harder to push, but at long last he gave one final push upwards, and there was a loud crashing noise as something heavy landed in the grate. There you are, he said. What did I tell you? Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses and peered at the round, black, bristly object lying on the hearth. It looks a funny sort of bird's nest to me. In fact, if you ask me, it's more like a brush out of the chimney sweeping fit. You're quite right, said Mr. Briggs. It's a brush, all right. Mrs. Briggs began to look even more puzzled as he picked up the object and examined it closely. It seems to be some sort of container, he said. That's not a container, said Mrs. Brown. It's Paddington's hat. Good heavens! So it is, exclaimed Mr. Brown. But what's it doing in the chimney and with my brush inside it? Mercy me, interrupted Mrs. Bird, looking out the window. Look! The others turned and gazed in her direction. I can't see anything, said Mr. Brown. Is anything the matter? Asked Mrs. Brown, looking at her housekeeper. You've gone quite white. I thought I saw a chimney pot go past the window, exclaimed Mrs. Bird, reaching for her smelling salts. Mr. and Mrs. Brown exclaimed glances. Normally, Mrs. Bird was the sanest member of the family, and it was most unusual for her to have hallucinations. So a chimney pot is the thing that covers the chimney at the top to keep rain from coming in. Sometimes it's square, sometimes it looks like a little roof, sometimes it's circle. And so she's seen this object go running past the window. What do you think it is? I have a feeling it is. Anyway, here's a picture of Paddington cleaning up the mess. Looks like a little black ghost running around. I think you better sit down, said Mrs. Brown, drawing up her chair. Perhaps the excitement's been too much for you. It's all right, Mrs. Bird, came a familiar, somewhat muffled voice. It's only me. Mrs. Bird had been taken by surprise a moment before. The others looked even more amazed as they turned and stared at the black object before them. In place of his usual headgear, Paddington was wearing what appeared to be half of a chimney pot, which covered his ears and came out over his eyes like an oversized top hat. I'm afraid it broke off when Mr. Briggs poked his rods up, he explained when the noise had died down. But what on earth are you doing up the roof in the first place? Asked Mrs. Brown. I was dusting the chimney, said Paddington. The brush got detached by mistake, and I was trying to rescue it. Paddington, echoed Mr. Briggs disbelievingly as he levering the pot off. Did you say Paddington? Looks more like a Clapham Junction to me. Proper mess he's in. Paddington looked most offended at Mr. Briggs' words as he sat on the floor rubbing his ears. It had been bad enough losing Mr. Brown's brush on the chimney in the first place, but then it got his head stuck in the pot he had mistaken for a bird's nest into the bargain seemed the unkindest cut of all. I know one thing, said Mrs. Bird sternly. You're going straight up to the bathroom. You must be the dirtiest bear within 50 miles. Mrs. Briggs gave a sudden chuckle as he looked at the others. I'll say this much. You may not have the cleanest bear within 50 miles, but I'm willing to bet there isn't a cleaner chimney. Paddington looked at Mr. Briggs gratefully and then hurried out of the room before any more questions could be answered. For once in his life he agreed with Mrs. Bird that a nice hot bath with plenty of soap was the best order of the day. Apart from that, he had just remembered that he hadn't eaten his sausage salad, let alone his treacle pudding. Paddington was very keen on treacle pudding, and he was anxious to make sure the cooker was turned on so that it would be ready for him when he came back downstairs. All right, so there we have it. Paddington has made himself a mess. What, are you surprised? All right, so next week we'll go to the next chapter.